All right, welcome to night one of backend development for the full stack web track. So this section is all about, it's basically all about the things that have up until this point been the black box. You know, when you have your front end app and you need something from the server, you need some data, you need information, you need to submit something, you need to delete something, whatever it is, there's kind of this magical black box that you guys have been relying on where you send out a request and you get something back. So this section is all about exploring what happens on the other side of that. Now it's our job to wait for those requests and to process them and to send back what we need to. And there's a lot that goes into that. So we'll be breaking that down over the next few weeks and then break and then next few more weeks. So I want to start by actually kind of opening the floor up in Slack and asking you guys, what is the back end? Yeah, I've given you a little bit of an answer already, but it's something that you've been tangentially exploring throughout this course so far. So if you guys want to throw things into Slack, just let me know how would you define the back end? And you'll find that I often ask for your input. So be ready to give me interesting responses to my questions. Data, APIs and databases, server, the rest of the iceberg, nice. The good stuff, like it, behind the scenes, all great answers. And for when if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the question thread. If I'm just asking you for input, you can go ahead and just put that in the regular section on Slack. So those are all excellent answers. I really like this idea of it's the rest of the iceberg. So it's I talk a lot in my intro course about the difference between thinking like a web user versus thinking like a web developer. We're now very much in the territory of thinking like a web developer. We have to start thinking about the things that as a simple web user, you don't have to worry about. As far as a more literal response, you guys are absolutely right that it's about APIs, it's about servers, it's about databases and data handling. There's this whole process that we go through where when you submit a server from the front end, it first hits the API, it's received by the server, it's processed. Usually some stuff is grabbed from the database or entered into the database or removed, and then it comes back out of the database and back into more of your regular server code, and then it spits back a response. So there's this nice little flow of data that happens. And we're going to be spending our time in this section exploring how that looks and how we can build it. So to talk a little bit more about those sections, I want to mention the API. So I remember when I was going through my own bootcamp that API was one of my least favorite terms because it seems so nebulous to me. No one could really give me a perfect definition of what in the world is the API. But I think of the API as the starting point when you're talking about backend. It's the bridge where the backend and the front end meet. It's the piece of the backend that's exposed so that the front end, or if you have a public API, any old programmer can access it. So that's really our starting point with the backend is that bridge. And this is going to be more familiar to you guys because you're used to sending requests from the front end. You're used to receiving responses. So you already see what one half of the puzzle looks like. Now we're going to find out what the other half of that piece that locks in. So that's one of the things we're going to be exploring tonight is building some of that API and specifically looking at how to receive GET requests. So we'll be doing a lot with CRUD. And CRUD, apart from being the stuff that builds up behind the faucet in your bathroom, is, of course, an acronym for Create, Read, Update, Destroy. So it's kind of your basic API, your basic server should be able to do these things with the database. You should be able to create something in the database, to read something that already exists out of it, to update an entry, or to delete something. Of course, it gets really complex because you don't want anyone to be able to do any old thing at any time. But for a starting point, we'll just be working on creating endpoints for that. And even more simply for tonight, we'll be just looking at read. So read corresponds to a GET request. So we'll be looking at how to give the front end whatever information they want. So that's our starting point for the backend. And of course, we know that these requests rely on endpoints, which are essentially just URLs that we use to get at that, since we're just doing gets tonight, to get at whatever bit of data we're interested in. So that's what you guys have to look forward tonight. We're going to build a basic server, and it turns out that because of the magic of Express, building a server is actually extremely simple, at least a bare bones one. So we're going to build a simple server, and then we're going to explore how to receive GET requests. And in order to do that, the two biggest tools we need are going to be Node and Express. So can anyone, let's start with Node. Can anyone in Slack tell me what Node is? What is Node.js? I see that several people are typing. Server-side JavaScript built on C++. JavaScript outside of the browser. I see something that says Node is a framework for the backend. And I'm really glad that you posted that, Michael, because not to call you out, but that's not quite correct. But I'm glad you posted that because that is what I thought Node was for the longest time. So Node is a little bit of an oddball because it's not its own language, but it's not exactly a framework per se. It's a runtime environment. And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? And we won't dig into the deep, dark depths of what exactly Node is, but functionally, you guys have hit the important points. I saw that someone said it's a way that we run JavaScript outside the browser. That's exactly right. JavaScript was built as a front-end language. It was built to be run by the browser, which of course is great when we're doing front-end code. But Node is what makes it possible to run our JavaScript code outside of the browser. And it turns out that it has a bunch of other cool stuff built in. So I think this is a good moment for me to share my screen so we can start to look at some docs and look at the stuff that we're actually talking about. So let me share my screen. Okay, here is the syllabus, and let's look at the Node docs. So, so Node is, and you guys should all have Node installed at this point because you've been using NPM already. If you, for some reason, don't, or at a later date need to reinstall it, there's instructions on how to do that right here at nodejs.org. Looking at the docs, there's actually a lot more to Node than just we can run JavaScript outside the browser. So if you guys want a rabbit hole to dive into, and pretty much learning how to program and being a programmer is just an endless opportunity to dive into rabbit holes, you can always explore some of the other interesting things going on with Node. But for our purposes, we can think of it as a nice place where we can run JavaScript outside of the browser. We can also think of it as the environment that we'll use to build our servers. And it's awfully nice that we can build servers using Node because as developers, we all have to learn JavaScript for the front end. So it's convenient that we can also use it for the back end. All right, so that's Node. And then the next thing I want to talk about is, well, let me actually bust out the command line real quick. So when I say I can use Node to run JavaScript outside of the browser, there's a very literal way I mean that. And this isn't necessarily something you need to know, but I think it's useful for getting some context for what Node is. So if I don't have a sample file, but let's say in this Lambda projects directory, I had a file called samplecode.js, just a JavaScript file. If I were to run the command Node followed by samplecode.js, it would just run. So if you have a JavaScript file, a standalone JavaScript file on your computer and you just want to run it, you can do that just using Node. So that's cool. We can do that. Another thing is that there is a little built-in Node REPL. So if you ever want to just mess around with JavaScript, you can just type the command Node and is there? Yeah. So if I run this, it'll just give me a little console. If I do, give me 6. etc. So there's I'm not sure if you've been introduced to this yet, but there's a little node REPL built into your command line. So a couple of cool random things about node. How do I get out of here? I haven't used this in a minute. Anyone know? I'm stuck in the REPL. We're just, I guess, lessons canceled. I'm stuck in the node REPL. Control C, didn't I try Control C? I guess not. Okay, awesome. Thank you guys. All right, so that is the node REPL. Just kidding, class is not canceled because I am back out of it. All right, so, and another nice thing about node is, actually, yeah, I think I already said that. All right, moving on from node. So if we wanted to build servers in raw node, we can, but we don't want to. In fact, when I went through my coding bootcamp, they made us build servers in raw node, and it was horrible, and I've never done it since. So what is the tool that we use? What is the framework on top of Node that we like to use to build servers? Anyone know? I think I mentioned it briefly already. Express, yes. Express is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So you could think of Express as being to Node like React or Angular is to JavaScript, or to front-end JavaScript. It's people were building servers in Node and they were writing the same logic over and over again, and it was wordy and it was a waste of time and it wasn't dry, so someone built Express. And I think Express is truly a masterful framework. There's a reason that there aren't competing, to my knowledge at least, there aren't really competing JavaScript frameworks for the backend, and that's because Express is just awesome, and why would you ever need anything else? So we will be exploring a lot of Express. And what I always like to do with frameworks is try to differentiate what's Express versus what's just JavaScript. Hopefully at this point you've learned enough JavaScript that it's easy to tell, but that is, I think, one of the challenges of learning something with a framework is you easily start to forget what's not just, things start to feel given that aren't actually given. But we'll get into that when we dive into actually using Express. So we will be using Express tonight to create a simple server and to listen and handle some GET requests. So let's talk a little bit more about Express, what it does, some other tools that you might use for backend, which we won't be using in this course, but are good to be aware of. So let me hop on over to the syllabus. Do Express. So the first thing that we really need to talk about with any sort of server is routing. And routing is all about receiving requests, right? So as we know, when we receive HTTP requests, they come in at endpoints, or essentially just URLs. So we need to create the logic that listens and handles. So let's think again about kind of the difference between front-end HTTP requests and back-end HTTP requests, because you're used to looking at it from one side, and now we have to kind of rotate 180 degrees. So, so when you're writing front-end code, it's kind of like, it's more active, it's more proactive. You're like, oh, hey, I need a thing. And then you send a request to get it. Or you're like, oh, hey, the user wants to create something, and you send a request to get it. It's very much like, I need something, I want to do something, let's go get it. The backend is more passive. The backend listens. The backend's job is to be ready for anything. So the backend is just kind of hanging out listening. And then when the front end demands something and is like, oh, hey, I need all the users from Kentucky, it's the backend job to go, okay, let me find you those, and here they are. Or there's no users from Kentucky, or you didn't send me the things I want, so I'm going to decline your request, or you're not authorized to get this information, so I'm going to decline your request. That's the backend's job. It's the gatekeeper. So of course, routing is an important piece of Express, and we'll start to look at that tonight. That's just setting up the different endpoints that are available, setting up what you can get where and who's allowed to get them, and what we will send back if your request is approved, and what we'll send back if your request is denied. That's all the kind of stuff we need to do. And it turns out that Express is built in a really useful way to handle that kind of thing. So bare bones Express is pretty much just routing. But what's really cool about Express is, first of all, that it is bare bones. It's an extremely simple framework, but you can make it as complex and as, you can make it more complex if you want, and you can customize it if you want with something called middleware. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about middleware tonight because it's hard to understand what it is or why it's important until we've even seen some Express. But I will just basically say Express is, or middleware is the thing that allows you to customize your server and make it more robust and make it more intricate. Some of this middleware is logic that's already been built out for you that you import. Some of it can be completely customizable. So we'll see a lot more of that next week. And then what else? Oh, wait, I'm not on the right page. Let's go down here. I was like, wait, deployment, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight. Here we go. Features of Express, that's where I wanted to be. We talked about middleware, we talked about routing, convenience helpers. And once again, this will make more sense once we actually get into the Express code. Essentially, this means that the kind of things that you want to do a lot are just built in. So something that would take, 10 lines of code if you were trying to write it in raw node is just one simple little function that's built in. And I'll show you a couple examples of that. There's views. So views, I want to mention briefly. Views are important if you're not writing a single page application. So you guys have been writing single page apps, SPAs, with React. And as a little reminder, the difference between a single page app and a server rendered app is that, think of it this way. Let's say you go to a website and you're going to start in the home page. With a single page app, even though you're starting in the home page, it's actually going to, from the get-go, send you all the information you need for, not the data, but all the view-related, all the HTML-related information you need for all the pages you might visit. And then if you click on another page, that's already on your computer, on the client-side computer. And then it'll just fill in the gaps with whatever data it needs from the database. And that's a really common way to build apps in this day and age. But there's another option, right? Which is a little bit of the old way of doing it, which is that I go to this page, the server sends me the page. Now I click on the next page, the server sends me that page. So if you want to write an app that way, you can use views. There's also a pretty cool way to actually integrate in React and have React actually working on the back end to render views, but we're not going to get into that. So just know that that's part of Express. That's one of the things you could use with Express. So that is kind of where we're at. That's the high level explanation of what's a server, what's the backend, what can we use Express for, why is Express great? Oh, there's one more thing a couple more things I wanted to mention real quick. Express docs. As is always the case with docs, once again, it's a rabbit hole. You could spend the next 3 months just digging through the Express docs. I'll teach you the stuff you need to know for now. You can always reference it, especially if you're interested in going a little deeper. But just be aware, like everything else, the documentation is there and available to you. And then the final little thing I wanted to mention is I wanted to do a quick little compare-contrast between Express and some of the other tools that we might use to build a server. So two really popular tools are Django and Rails. So the biggest difference between something like Express and those tools are that Express really is building blocks. It's like Legos or Connects. There's all the things you need to build what you want are there, but you have to do the building. So it's lightweight, but it's very customizable. And something like Rails is going to fall on the opposite end of the spectrum. With a Rails app, you can literally put a command in your command line and ta-da, you have like a full server built. But the downside of that is that you're kind of stuck doing things the Rails way. So I'm a big fan of Express because I like to actually customize things and build things myself, but different things are going to be useful for different projects. So just to give you a little information about some other tools and a little compare contrast. All right, so that is a nice little intro of what we're looking at. I really want to get into the meat of things as quickly as possible, because that's the most interesting part, and that's where you guys start to learn. The one I keep saying we're ready to get to the coding, and then I think of other things I need to talk about. The last thing I promise, unless I think of something else, thing I want to talk about before we get into more of the actual coding is REST. So I don't want to spend much time talking about REST because I think it's hard to understand what it means until you have a little experience writing backend code. So it's something that hopefully I'll just introduce tonight, and an idea that we'll come back to as we explore more and more pieces of this backend puzzle. So REST is an architectural style. So it's not a framework, it's not a language, it's not a package. It's like guidelines for how to write good code or how to write good backend code. And if you guys want to spend some time reading over this in Training Kit or watching videos on YouTube about REST, be my guest. But the biggest piece I want to point out to you just at the start is this idea of everything is a resource. So let's say that we had some sort of blogging app. We're going to have users, we're going to have posts, we're going to have comments. If there's a direct messaging system built in, there are going to be messages. If it's more of a social media type thing, there might be friends or watch it. If you can watch other people, other users. You would think of all those things as being resources. So that is a really good conceptual way to think about this. So tonight we're going to be writing or starting to write a very simple server that deals with users. So we would say users are our resource. And in the future of this course, as things get a little more open-ended, I might say, build me a server that manages 2 related resources. And it would be up to you to figure out, okay, I want my resources to be, I don't know, users and, now I can't think of anything, users and brain melting. I don't know, you get the point. So we want to think of everything as being resources. And then if we start at that place and structure endpoints around that, things are going to they're going to be clean, they're going to work well, it's going to be scalable. The rest of this stuff is also important, but I think it's just hard to talk about in a meaningful way when we haven't even written our first server. So I'm going to kind of breeze over it for now. Okay. So now we are about to get started on, I'm going to do some coding and you guys can code along or watch me code. But first, does anyone have any questions? The question thread has been awfully quiet. So I will give you guys a little invitation to ask any questions you might have at this point. All right, doesn't seem like people have questions. Cool, so let's, oh wait, I see a question, yay. Cool, so a question about single page applications and speed. One little subtle point I mentioned this briefly, I want to say again, is that you don't get all of the data in a single page app. You get all of the view type stuff. So if you think about like a social media page, you would get all the, the structure of what does my news feed look like, but it's not until you go to that feed that you actually get the raw data, the database stuff like the posts. But all the HTML, CSS type stuff you get from the get-go. So now to answer your actual question about speed, you're absolutely right. That with a single page app, when you first load the page, it's going to be a little slower because you're getting all the stuff at once. But as you click around and go to different pages, it will be really fast. And we like that. It's better to kind of front load that. As opposed to if you were actually using Express views, it would be a little slower each time you loaded a new page. I think I remember being a kid and I would click on a site and it would be like loading really slowly. And then I would click on a different page on the site and it would be like, so that's like an exaggerated view, example of what it would look like to not use a single page app. Everything is loading independently. Luckily, now it doesn't do that, even if it's not a single page app. I see another question about, could I explain the resource principle again? I don't want to spend too much time on this because once again, I think it makes a ton more sense once you actually start writing some code. But it's basically, think about all the nouns involved in your app. You know, if there's, I wrote this songwriting app a while back. So our resources would have been, you have users, but then each user has a song, and each song has a recording, and each song also has a lyrics page, and each song also has a note section. So you would think of notes, recordings, lyrics, users, and songs all as being resources. So it's like the things involved in the app. Question about, can Express do everything that Rails and the others can? That's a really complex question. I will just say the short answer is no, but yes to the important stuff. So yes, in terms of it can create endpoints and interact with databases, all the important pieces, but you know, there are going to be little things that different languages, I mean, really at the end of the day, like if you want to build a server, you could probably do it in any of those languages, but there are things that are going to be much easier in one language versus another, and there might be very specific things that you just can't do in one versus the other. And then as far as coding along, there really isn't a sandbox you can use, but we're going to be going based off of a Git repository. So you guys can clone down this repo if you'd like. So I'm going to switch. And there's a question, would it be fair to say resources are somewhat comparable to components in React? It's been a long, I'll be totally honest, it's been a long time since I've used React. But I think yes, hopefully. Maybe I just shouldn't answer that question because I might lead you astray. So, okay, well, let's, let me go ahead and hop on over to this Git repository. There are two repositories that are relevant to tonight's lecture and the lecture on Thursday. The first is this Node Express Lab. This is going to be your homework. I will talk about this more at the end. The second one we're going to be playing with today. This is Node Express Mini. So this is where I'm getting my code for tonight from. So I would encourage you guys to pull this up and also clone it. And in that way you can do some coding along. And a note about coding along, I know I said it, but I don't think it's actually that helpful if you literally code along. I definitely want you to clone this and be working on it. But while I'm actually typing code, please be paying attention to what I'm doing and what I'm saying. I will give you little breaks where you can catch up. So don't be literally coding as I'm coding, and don't be panicking and feeling like you need to catch up. I'll give you a chance to kind of catch up and tinker around with it yourself. All right, so let me go ahead and clone this. Is my terminal big enough? Can everyone see my terminal all right, or do I need to make that bigger? All right, cool. And then let's get VS Code up and running. I'm also new to VS Code. I've been a Sublimer for many years, and I'm trying it out. So I apologize if I'm fumbling around with VS Code. You guys probably know VS Code better than I do at this point. So tips and tricks are welcome. Yeah, I like it a lot so far. I feel like I should have made the leap a while ago, but here I am, better late than never. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we've just cloned down here. So first of all, okay, I cloned it. What's going to be my first step? What's the first thing you want to do when you have a new repository? Yarn, yes. So installing. Oops, what the? That's not good. What have I done? Am I actually in it? Wait. Oops. Read the README, also a good idea. Let me try this again. I deleted it and cloned it back down, so that might be it. Okay. Express. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, yeah. So we've 2 excellent suggestions. We're installing, and then let's check out our README. Where are you? I know there's a way to like, I know this is terrible. I'm asking you guys for help with my text editor. There's a way to like render the README so it looks pretty. Do you guys know how to do that? I've seen it. Right click, preview. Like right click the file. Where is it? Up here? Just clicking things. Just clicking things willy-nilly. Oh, cool. All right, well, that worked. Let's get rid of the other one. Sweet. Just click random things until it works. Classic. All right, so here is our README. So we want to start by yarning, which we already did. Database. Ooh, there's a database. So databases are critical to backend development. What we will be doing in a few weeks is actually building out the functionality ourselves. But for today, that's already built out for us. So we just have to use the methods. So there's this whole data folder. You guys don't really, that's literally the database exists in this file. You don't have to worry about migrations or seeds, but you do sort of have to worry about this file. Mostly you just need to be aware that there are these 5 methods that we can and should use to access the database. If you're, again, another rabbit hole for you guys, if you want, you can play around and see what these actually look like, a little preview of the kind of code you will be writing in a few weeks. But for now, you just have to worry about, or you just have to be aware that there are these 5 methods that will help us with our CRUD operations. And what's even better is that our README actually has a description of all 5 of these. So we don't, when we're trying to figure out what different methods and things that are available to us are, there's kind of 2 ways to do it. One is to find documentation like this. The other is to actually tinker around in the code and try and understand how it's working. Honestly, a combination of the 2 approaches are good. But these are pretty simple, so hopefully you guys won't have too much problem using these. So that's awesome. We know that there is some database stuff, and we know that the only thing we really need to worry about are these 5 methods. And we have a nifty little explanation of what each of those does. So I mentioned that we're only going to be worrying about GET requests today. So which of these database methods do you think we might use by the end of the lecture? Anyone want to venture an informed guess? Find and find by ID. Exactly. So these are the 2 GET related database operations. We're going to be able to find a master list of users, and we're also going to be able to find individual users based on their ID. Awesome. So that will be fun when we get to that. All right, let's see what else we have in here. So starting the API. So we're going to, so servers, I'll talk more about this in a minute, but remember that I said that the server's job is to listen. It's kind of this waiting game. It's just hanging out, waiting for the front end to make demands on it. So in order to get it up and listen, it's not just automatically listening. So we're going to have to run a command line command to get our server to start listening. And that command is yarn server or npm run server. I want to make a note about this, which is this is not a guaranteed command. This is a command that's specific to this repository. So you can't assume that any old server will start with yarn server. It could be another command, and we can even play around with it and change that word if we want to. Uh-oh, no, I turned it back to not pretty. How did I do that? It's time for me to press buttons again until it fixes. I don't think that's the most efficient way to do it. Yeah, yarn start, that's exactly, yarn start is a very common one too. It says preview. I know, oh, I think I know what's going on. All right, we'll close this and go over. By the way, just if you guys haven't figured out already, I'm like kind of the classic like geek who can't figure out how to do basic things. So if you're like, build me a hash table that blah, 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 I'll be like, oh, no problem. But if you're like, ooh, figure out how to make the README preview, I'll be like, oh, how do you do it? So I've learned at this point, I just need to own it. Okay, so yeah, so that's an important command. And we can even, actually, we're not gonna do it just yet, but we will do it soon. The next thing that the README mentions is the user schema. So we have these users. Users are our resource. So we're dealing with one resource in this little server project, and we need to know the schema or the shape. So that just means the data shape, you know. So we'll think about each of these as being, at least the JavaScript representation of each of these, as being an object that has 4 different, oh, and I've done it again. So each of these objects have 4 different keys: name, bio, created at, and updated at. So it's good to know what we can expect our data to look like when we're trying to retrieve it. And then this is a little explanation of what we want our API to look like. So our job is to build, by the end of today, these 2 endpoints, API/users and API users/ID. So we want something that we can use to get a master list of users, and something that where we can get just a single user. We see that the API also has these other 3 endpoints that we'll be playing with on Thursday for posting, deleting, and putting. So since we're starting out the server stuff, there's on this mini project and on your homework, there's very detailed specifications of what these things should look like. In fact, here they are. It's telling you everything you need. So for now, we're going to give you exactly what you need to write. But as we move along in this section, we're going to be giving you less and less information, because it's going to be up to you as the developer to figure out what needs to happen and the best way for that to happen. So kind of scary, kind of exciting. All right, and I see a little question about, are we learning Express or Node? We are learning both. And actually, once I get into the coding, I'll kind of point out this piece is just Node specific. This piece is Express specific. And I'll try and do that whenever I can. And if you ever have a question about what is Node and what's Express, please ask. I think knowing the difference is a really nice way to become a more sophisticated developer. All right, so there's some specifications. We won't worry about those just yet. The last thing, which is kind of actually mentioned as a side note almost, but I think is really important, is it talks about this index.js file. So every server has a starting point. And the starting point is a portal into everything else you need. This is going to be our starting point. It's often called index.js or server.js. So this is our starting point. And I will say that as we get into more and more intricate servers, this should not be the only file. It really should be a portal into different modularized things. But because we're writing something pretty simple tonight, we'll just lump it all in this one file. And as we get into more of the routing stuff in Express, you'll see some of the useful ways to modularize this out. Cool, so we are almost ready to go. I want to go ahead and do that. Does anyone remember what my command is to get my server up and running? And I'll throw a little console log in here just to make sure we see what we're doing. Yarn server. So let's do that. Cool. Did we? Oh, I forgot to save. So this is kind of cool. I save this and it restarts this, it reruns the file. So whenever I change this, it's going to actually detect it and run it again. And that's because of Nodemon. So, or Nodemon, or however you say that word. I always think of it as Nodemon in my head, but I've definitely heard it both ways. Nodemon, like Jamaican, like Nodemon. Okay. So, yeah. So why, let's talk about it's a Digimon. Okay, I'll think of that. So NodeMon. For those of you who don't know, this is just a nifty tool that allows the server to restart every time changes are made. This is a beautiful, beautiful thing. You do not want to write server-side code without it. So why is it that this command works, and why is it that it works with NodeMon? Well, that's in our lovely package.json. So we see that the script server points at running our index.js file with NodeMon. If we change this to a different file, it would run a different file. If we got rid of this or changed it to Node, there wouldn't be this nifty restart. And if we change this, we could change this to anything we want. We could change it to start. And now we would need to run yarn start. We could change it to potato, but don't do that. And then the command would be yarn potato, which is a really silly image, but would probably confuse all developers. So no yarn potatoing. So let's put this back to server. So just a little note about where that thing is coming from. All right, back to our index.js. Cool, so we've added a console log, but this really isn't a server yet. So I think it's actually perfect timing here. This thing is not a server yet. So we'll do a little break, and then we'll actually create our first server. So before we go on break, catch up on a couple questions. There was another question about Node versus Express. So Node is our runtime environment. So Node is kind of the bigger umbrella. Node is what allows us to run JavaScript outside of a browser. So the language is JavaScript. Node is the environment it's running in, and Express is the framework. So Express is adding new functionality. And we're actually, right after the break, going to import Express and start using it. So I think it'll be a little more clear about what Express is once we start using it. And a reminder about what NodeMon is. It's just a tool that allows us to not have to run a command every single time we want to restart our code. So we're able to actually have our code dynamically restart itself as we make changes to it. So and if we have a little extra time, maybe I'll play around with removing NodeMon so we can see what happens when we don't have it. But not a big priority, so I might not get to it. Okay, all right, so time for a little break, and then we will come back. And uTorrent is running in my background. Is it? It shouldn't be. Let's get rid of you. Gone. I don't think anything's running on it, though. I haven't torrented anything in like 3 years. I put that wayward life behind me. Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to take a little break, and then we will actually create a server in this file. So let's have a little 5-minute thing here and go. And for the record, the only reason I've put torrenting behind me is not for moral reasons. It's just for laziness. I went from being a college student with no money to a developer with more money than time. So it was just easier to actually buy things than torrent them. That is, like, I remember actually hearing this really brilliant thing that the reason that torrenting was so popular is not because people didn't want to pay, but just because it was actually the easiest way to get content. Kind of an interesting perspective on it. But I'd like to think that I'm still like a pirate on a metaphysical level, if not on a literal pirating movies and music level. And Spotify, yes. Netflix and Spotify and Amazon killed torrenting for me. Not a big Hulu fan. I feel like, I don't know, I just get bad vibes. I know that Amazon is really like the evil person I need to worry about, but I can't think of Amazon as evil because I live on a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, and I wouldn't be able to buy like anything that I want or needed without Amazon. So Amazon is kind of my lifesaver. Yeah, so just to give you, while we're taking a break, an idea of how ridiculous my life with Amazon is. I live on this like crazy hillside with like these narrow, winding European-esque streets, and it's like pretty ridiculous. My car is parked basically at a vertical angle, but there's no mail service on our on like the entire historic district of town. So you have to like walk down the hill and go to this old historic post office and like go up to and like go in your little PO box and you get a slip and you go up to the attendant and you're like, hey, I need my 80 things I ordered off Prime 2 days ago. And if it's the person at the post office who likes you, they're like, cool. And if not, they give you the evil look. And then you carry it out to your car and then you drive back up the hill. So that's pretty much my life. But I live in a now renovated house that was like a miner's shack in the late 1800s. So that's pretty cool. I bet you guys can't say that. Oh, I put on the timer and then I totally moved the thing so you can't see the timer. Painting your apartment's pretty, okay, what color did you paint your apartment? That's the real question. A few, nice. Ooh, 3-story historic house in Pittsburgh. I love Pittsburgh. That's like, Pittsburgh is one of my favorite places. I would probably live in Pittsburgh if I weren't such a wimp when it comes to the cold. Nice. I'm glad I'm like opening the door to all the like weird historic houses and buildings that you guys live in too. This is fun. I've been teaching the intro class, which is only an hour, so we didn't get breaks. But I'm like, ooh, I have like 5 whole minutes dedicated to whatever useless, strange small talk I feel like babbling about. All right, we're pretty much out of time, so let's get back to building a server. It's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be like shockingly easy. Fun fact that I've been doing that you guys can do too if you want. So in prepping for this class, for teaching this class, I went through and was like doing some of the homework and just playing around with Express. And it's fun to be like, to tell people who aren't coders, like, yeah, I just built a server, because people are really intimidated by the word server. Like they think it's like, oh my God, you just built a server? As you're about to see, it turns out that just building a bare bones server is like, it's like 6 lines of code. It's really easy, but people don't know that. So now that you're about to learn how to do this, you'll be able to be like, yeah, just built a server. It takes like 5 minutes. It takes less than 5 minutes to build a server. To build a server that works well and does interesting things and is meaningful takes much longer, but that's what we don't mention. Yes, or building the hardware for a server also. All right, let's get back over here and we'll build ourselves a server. Okay. So first of all, we need Express. There's a little sample in the in here of how to, let me see if I can find it. If we want to build a server not with Express, where is it? Somewhere in here. We could do that, but this is still not that bad. This is lame. We don't want to do this. This is what we would do if we didn't have Express, but we do. So forget about that nonsense. let's go ahead and build a server with Express. Okay, so we need Express. How are we going to get Express? Kind of an open-ended question. There are a couple ways to answer it. Require, we will have to require it. Import it. Yarn, that's the place to start. Yep, so it's a package, so we need to yarn add it. And so I'm gonna actually have to close out of my server and we'll do yarn add express. So yeah, there are kind of two different ways to think about this question. The first is we need to add it. We need to import the package. But we also need to, or we need to actually download it, but we also need to import it. And so I saw a require and an import, which brings me to my next point, which is you might be thinking, okay, the next step is something like import express from express. But we probably don't want to do that. So this is from ES 2015, and it's not always supported. So there is something better, or at least more widely supported, and that's called a require statement. So this is something that's node specific. So I mentioned I was going to talk about what's node specific. That we could think of a require as being node specific because you can't use requires in regular old JavaScript. But it's not an express thing, it's node. So this is how we are going to, from now on, at least in the backend world, get our packages in. We're going to require them. It's also how we are going to allow different files to talk to each other. So we do require express, and then we actually want to save express into a constant. So I'm going to make this a little wider. Cool. So now we have express. So this constant, what is it? This is kind of an open-ended question. It's obviously some sort of JavaScript object. It is a new variable. Here's a better question. What type of JavaScript object is this? Anyone know? I'll give you a hint. It's kind of a trick question. There's really no way of knowing what this is without reading the docs. We could always try type of. It turns out express is actually a function. So, and once again, there'd be no way to know that without just knowing it. I mean, you'll know that pretty quickly because you'll use express a lot. But if you were importing a different module, could check the docs. So it turns out that express is a function. And it's a function that returns a server. So you'll usually see a line of code that's either const server or maybe const app equals express, and you just call it. No parameters, just call it. So this express thing that we are going to require is a function, and it will return to us an object. So the server thing is an object, and it contains a bunch of useful methods that will allow us to build our server easily. So this is the express stuff. So all the methods that we're going to be using off of server is built into express. That's not node specific, that's actual express logic. So the first thing we really want to do with our server is get it to listen. So I've already used this word listen, this idea of that a server is a thing that's just kind of waiting. It's just hanging out. Think of it as like a fisherman. It's just hanging out, waiting for something to happen. So we have to tell the server to start waiting, to start listening. And it turns out that there is turns out that there's a function built on this called listen. So there we go. We're going to need to put in a port number. Let's do 4,000. And then a callback. Cool. So we've done sort of our first couple express related things. Of course, calling the express function, which plops out that server object is express specific. And then any of these methods that we use on this object are going to be express specific. The first one and the critical one, I say the first one, it actually needs to be the last thing on the page. So literally it's last on the page, but it's the first thing in terms of you need this. This is critical to have your server. So at this point, we actually have a server, right? It was, I said, 3 lines of code. So there we go. We have server.listen on a port, and then we can have a little callback, something like server is up and running. Okay, so this is the instructions for how to get our server to be created and listen. How do we start the server? How do we run this file? Same thing, starting the server, running this file, or equivalent. Yarn server, nice. So now it is actually listening, and we can just, oh, I always forget to save it. Cool, and we even get our little confirmation. So it's nice to have a little console log inside of your listen method because you want that confirmation that yes, this thing is up and running. I think that as far as this callback, I think there's an error. I would probably want to double check the docs on that, but I'm pretty sure that there is an error parameter on this one. So you could always put in an if statement to put a little note about and what happened and log the error. So like, actually, I think I can generate an error if I want to. I don't know. I'm not going to worry about that right now. Yeah, so let's talk about this port, this number here. And in order to talk about the port, we kind of have to dig into a little deeper of what is a server. So, so let's talk a little bit about the internet, right? What's cool about the internet is that I'm here in Bisbee, Arizona, and you're in your old farmhouse in Pittsburgh, and I don't remember if it was a farm. I think the farmhouse was in Texas, and you're in Phoenix, and we're all over the place. But we can all go to these websites, right? And we can go to google.com. We can go to amazon.com to order a bunch of stuff we probably don't need because Cyber Monday already happened. But we can all go to these same websites and we get the same thing, right? And that's because there's a server. There's literally a computer, probably in a warehouse somewhere in the Midwest, where a server is up and running and it's listening. And when I go to amazon.com and you go to amazon.com, it connects over to that through a series of things that I don't fully understand, but I would love to understand some way, to that server, that computer somewhere in the Midwest in a warehouse. And it, and then it returns to me whatever I want or need. So somewhere there's a server listening, but how do I find it? How does my little typing amazon.com into the URL box connect with that computer? And that computer probably holds multiple things on it. So not only does it connect to the correct computer, but it also connects to the correct thing on the computer. And that's IP address and port and DNS and probably a bunch of other things that I don't fully understand. Yeah, it is a hard question. I do not fully understand the answer to that question by any stretch. And I'd be super, if you guys want to if you guys are IP address geeks and want to share anything on that, packets. I don't know what a packet is, but apparently it has to do with packets. The thing I want to get at is that every computer has an address, and within a computer, within an IP address, there are ports. So a metaphor I really like that I'm stealing directly from Luis, one of the other instructors, is this idea of thinking of it like an apartment building. The computer, the IP is like the street address of the apartment building, but the port is the apartment number. So this server that I've just created is not accessible by any of you guys. It's only going to be accessible on my computer, and that's because it's running on the local host. And we'll talk about that a little more, but essentially the local host is our shortcut way of just spinning up a server on our own local machine without having to worry about any of the extra stuff. But in order to do that, I need to specify a port number. So I can run many servers on my computer, But in order to find this one in particular, I need to know to look on port 400. A little note on port numbers. Some of them are already reserved. If you're 3,000 or over, you're probably good to go unless you already have a server or something else running on that same port. So yeah, so let's see how we get to this server. So let me actually open my browser. And a little reminder about browsers. Whatever you type into the URL bar up here, that's a GET request. So if I do localhost, let's just start by doing 440. There's nothing happening on 440. And when I try to go to localhost 440, it says it refused to connect. The site can't be reached. That's because there's nothing listening there. There's no server there. But if I go to 400, oops, or 4,000, not 400. It's still not quite working. It's still, the GET request has failed, but I'm getting a different response, right? There's a server there. There's something listening. There's nothing listening for a GET yet. There will be in a minute. But we see that we've made a little progress. Something is listening on this address. So for now, we'll just be spinning up servers on our local host. So you can always at least get the server, do a GET request to the server by typing in localhost and then your port number up here. And in fact, a nifty little thing to do that you'll see a lot is actually having a constant for your port. And I'll go ahead and actually refactor this really quick. And then you can do something like oops. So let's try this, save it. And we see that now our little message tells us actually which port it's up and running on. Nice, cool. So we sort of understand ports, or at least understand that there's this whole world of servers and IPs that we don't need to understand to do this. But we at least know that this server is up and running on our local machine, and we know how to do GET requests to it via our browser. As far as doing other requests, there is a tool called Postman that I've seen you guys already mention. Postman is a great tool for doing little requests to our server and making sure our server is working the way we want. Since we're only doing GETs for tonight, we won't worry about Postman, but we will definitely use it on Thursday. All right, so we have this thing. What do we want to do next? Let's do, actually, I'll open the question to you. What do you guys think we should do next with our server? And I'll give you a little hint by opening this page. Display something. So the result of what we do is we could display something. But from a server's point of view, we have to start paying attention to some specific endpoints. So now's the route part of this, the API part of it. So we need to start to say, hey, these are the endpoints that my server cares about, and this is what should happen when someone requests this endpoint. So a really good starting point for both this little app and in general is let's handle GET requests to our routes, to just the slash. So let's go ahead and do that. And this is another thing that's made very easy with Express. So there is another Express method called GET. And as you might imagine, there's actually Express methods for all of our request types. So we have two parameters here. We want to know the endpoint, and then we want to have a callback. So our endpoint is going to be slash. Is that that one? Yeah, that's the direction of slash we want. Thank you. All right, and then our callback. Any ideas what our what the parameters will be on this callback? Any guesses? Rec and res, the homies, yes. As a little reminder, rec and res, rec stands for request, res stands for response. So we are thinking about this in two parts. We're thinking about what did I get? What am I being requested for? What did the user or the client or the front end send my way? And then we're thinking about what do we send back? So both of these are objects. This one has to do with what we received. This one has to do with what we're going to send back. And we will see a couple things we might do with each of these before the lecture is up tonight. So let's go ahead and respond with something. So there are a few different, on res, there are a few different methods meant to respond, to send a response back. The most basic one is send. So we'll start out with a send. The one we're going to see the most of is actually JSON, but send is a good starting point. So let's go ahead and and feel free to brainstorm or guess here. What do you think, what types of things do you think we can send back? You guys should have some idea because you're used to being on the other end, receiving it. Objects, data, strings. We can't actually send back status codes. I'll talk about status codes in a minute, but you wouldn't want to put a status code inside of res.send. Arrays, objects, strings are all good. Error messages. And HTML, that's the last one I was waiting for. All good answers. And even the status code thing, even though it was technically, we don't put status codes in this method, status codes are a really important part of this process, and we'll talk about them really soon. So all really great answers. So let's start by sending back some text. This would be a good hello world moment. And we got it. Cool. If we wanted to make this bigger, we could always instead change this to some HTML code. Nice. So we already see we can send back strings, we can send back HTML, we can send back objects. Oops. Let's try that one. Cool. Oh, I guess, okay, as far as status codes, I'll talk about status codes in a minute. Let's see. So according to Kyle, we can actually send status codes. This isn't usually the syntax I use, but I think this does work. We save it. Cool, so I guess we can send status codes in here. I'm used to using the status method. Nice to know that there are multiple ways to do things. And I am a big believer that you shouldn't memorize anything you don't have to. So it's always like, there are a million things I don't know how to do because I learned how to do it one way. But it's good to know that and I think that's perfectly fine, but it is good to know that there are often many ways to do the same thing. And so when you see a bit of code, it's deprecated. So not the ideal way to do it. Aha, I'm vindicated. So you can do that, but not ideal. And I will show you how you should be doing that in a minute. Okay, so we've seen all that. Let's talk about JSON. So if we look over here at, let's look at our network. Come on. Here we go. The network. There's my requests. Where am I? What am I doing? Where am I going? Can you guys tell that I've been teaching basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the last year? Oh wait, and actually, you know what, I see someone talking about crashing their code. Before we get there, and it will give me a chance to figure out where in my network I'm going, I want to make sure you guys have a chance to catch up on this. So we have created, at this point, we've created a nice bare bones server. We've really technically, to just create a server, all you need to do is listen, but at least it does one thing now. We have one endpoint. So you guys catch up. If you are having any issues, post about it, and we'll pause for a minute and then we'll carry on. All right, who wants to tell me how I find my requests in network? I could just Google it too. And as far as server crashing, let me show you what a server crash looks like. So if I were to, I mean, really any syntax error, like let's say I just did a slash without anything else and saved it. So any sort of error in this, like a syntax error in here, is going to crash your server, and you'll see a little app crashed. And then when you fix it and save, we'll try refreshing this. Oh, there it is. All I need to do is refresh. Nice. All right, I'm going to do a little poll to see where you guys are at. And if you're not, I mean, if you don't have like a fully 100% understand everything, that is fine. But if you're really behind, you know, let me know. It looks like people are pretty good. Oh yes, see my code again, sure. All right, it looks like I'm strongly getting a ready to move on. Ooh, and I like this, what Julie just posted, which is, I mentioned this very briefly, but it's important, so I'll say it again. Which is make sure that this listen is the last thing that happens. We want this listen at the end of the code. So we want listening down here, and then we want all our endpoints up here. Cool. All right, so let's move on. So network, now that we got the network working. So the network, one thing that we can see here, status is set to 200. How did that happen? Well, it turns out that it will default set the status to 200, but we don't always want the status to be 200. So I will show you in just a minute how we can change that status if we want. The other thing I want to show you, if I can find it in here, is, where is it? I'm not finding it. All right, I'm not gonna mess around tinkering. But that should have spent more time in here. Okay, awesome. So now we can see a bunch of info about it. So we can see the URL it's coming from, the type of method, we can see the status code. But here's what I really wanted to talk about is the response headers. So this is one of those things that you don't think about that much because Express is magical. If we weren't using Express, we'd have to set these things manually. One of the things is this content type. So it assumes the content type is text/HTML. Let's see what happens if I change this to an object. What do you think is going to happen to the content type when I change this to an object? Is it going to be JSON now? Let's find out. Yep, JSON. So Express is smart enough to guess at what type of thing you're trying to send. But even though it's nice that it will guess, we don't really like it to have to guess. So usually if we're sending JSON, we'd actually rather do res.json. Now there is no ambiguity. It knows it's JSON. Even if we send a string, it'll try to kind of interpret it as JSON. So we like to, and we'll mostly be using res.json because we're not really going to be sending much HTML here. We're more interested in sending objects. So this is, again, something that it's hard to appreciate if you've never done it the other way. The other way to do this is you have to stringify it. You have to set your content type. You have to explicitly set your status to 200. All of that is taken care of for us just by res.json. But what if we wanted a different status? Well, there is a method called status, and we could always explicitly say 200. This is totally redundant. But if we wanted to say 400 or 500 or 404, we can do that too. And by the end of tonight, we'll actually see some cases where we would want to set a different status other than 200. So we will see more of that status in just a little bit. All right. So really as a backend developer, we're concerned with two really important things whenever we get a request. The number one is we need to send a response. We need to send a response. And we can do that with res.send. We can do that with res.json. The other thing is we need to set a status. In some ways, this is not as big of a deal because it will automatically set 200 for us. In other ways, it's more important to remember that because it'll automatically set 200 for us. So if we neglect to ask ourselves, what status do I want to send back? We might be accidentally sending back a 200 when actually we mean 404. So keep that status piece in mind. Even though you don't have to write it every time, you need to think about it every time you respond to a request. All right, so let's look at parameters. So we've played a little bit with this res object. What about rec? And I'm just gonna open this question to you guys. What are some things we might want to get out of the request object? When is a case that we might have relevant information we need from the requester? The body. So we'll look more at that on Thursday. When, for example, someone is doing a post request, they're actually going to send us a body full of data that we want to add to the database. So getting the body out of the request object is huge, though we won't really be looking at it tonight. A parameter, yeah. So that's something we will be playing with tonight. So sometimes we want to get a parameter out of this. So let me show you a little example of it. So let's say that we want to do something called, let's start with this. So we want an endpoint called greet. and it'll just say, well, let's go back to sending. Right, so now if we go to /greet, we get a little greeting. But what if we wanted the user to be able to optionally send a name? Well, that would have to go in the URL. So we see that we can have greet/:name. That means that name is a parameter that the client is sending us. So we will need to access that. So we get that out of rec. And it turns out that rec has a object called params attached to it. So this would be a thing, rec.params.name. So we could always pull it out and save it. There we go. So we've pulled that out of the params. So now instead of saying hello there, we could instead send let's try that. So if we go to greet, and if instead we go to ta-da, we're pulling a param out of our URL. So that is the one case in which we would actually want to pull information out of the request object. And for tonight, for the purposes of get requests, that you're going to see this. And it's going to be relevant to what we're trying to do for tonight, which actually reminds me nicely of, let me go back to the README. So as a little reminder, we are trying to actually do something here. So we see that we have 2 get endpoints that we want to write tonight, and we can see that one of them actually has a parameter. And this is one of the most common things you'll see in terms of parameters, is this ID parameter. Super common in terms of trying to actually request a specific item from the database by ID. So we're going to be getting both a master list of users and a list of users by IDs. So I think everything is pretty much in place for us to write these 2 endpoints. So before we go on and actually create these 2 endpoints, does anyone have any questions for me? Can I show the code again? Yes. Sorry. There it is. The status thing. I am actually going to pause because it's going to come up a little more once we start writing. So I will go over status again, but not right now. Something about an inject file. I have honestly no idea where that came. What are you guys up to? Where is this inject file coming from? I don't know. We could do a little quick Googling. Inject file node. Seems like it might have to do with gulp. I don't know. I can, if you guys want, I could do a little more exploring about that and post what I find on Slack, but I don't want to spend too much time bogging down on that. Ooh, there's a good question. Cannot find module express. So yes, that means that express is probably, I would, just to confirm, go to your package JSON and see if you can find, where is express? Yeah, it should be in dependencies, you should see express. If it's not there, which I suspect it's not, yes, you need to use yarn or npm to install it. And for everyone's sake, can anyone remind me of what command line code you would use to install Express? Yarn add Express, exactly. All right, let's go ahead and move on and kind of get rid of these endpoints and create our two endpoints that we want. So the first endpoint is going to be get, and I know I just deleted my code. What are my two parameters for the get method, or really any request method? What parameters do I need? The first is going to be rec and res. This is where it gets confusing. Rec and res are the parameters for my callback, but for just the get method, it's going to be a URL and a callback, exactly. So URL API.users. Let's double check that that's what they want from us. Yep, so the two endpoints are API/users and API users with an ID parameter. So API/users and then a callback. And you guys are ahead of the curve on the two parameters for this callback. It's going to be the homies, rec and res. Cool, so we can even just go ahead and actually copy and it doesn't hurt to type it out again to practice, but copy and paste this over and already set up the shell of our second endpoint that we're going to write. Cool. And we can call rec and res anything we want. It's good. I would say stick with rec and res or request and response. You could always call it, you know, input and output if you wanted. You could call it X and Y, but we like to name stuff as descriptive as possible. And this is one of those things where there is a convention. So when I say a convention, I mean it won't crash your code if you call them something else, but it will confuse your fellow developers. And this actually brings me to a really good meta point, which is that we are writing code. Think of yourself as writing code for developers. Code is its instructions to the computer, but always conceptualize it as you're writing the code for developers. You're writing it for your future self. You're writing it for the fellow developers on your team. So your first priority isn't to convey instructions to the computer, though that's very important. It's to convey what you're conveying to the computer to other developers. So that is why we want to stick with conventions like rec and res, because otherwise it will just create unnecessary confusion. Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and write this endpoint. All right. Anyone have an idea of what our first step is going to be here? It's something we haven't seen yet. How are we going to get this list of users back to the client? The database. So remember this DB file? Remember these 5 methods are going to be our portal into the database. So which of these methods do we need to get a master list of all our users? Find, absolutely. So we need to do db.find. All right, and this thing and database methods in general are going to be promises. We can pretty much expect these things to be promises. So what comes after a promise? Then and catch. Cool. So we'll put these down here. Cool. All right. Users. So here's a slightly weirder question. How did I know that the callback parameter in my then is going to be a users? How did I know that? Because we said so. That's actually, even though it's a silly answer, that's actually a brilliant answer. We don't know, you know, there are a few ways we can find out. I happen to already know because I'm the instructor, but there's no reason that you guys should magically know this. So a couple ways to find out: the README. We have some docs on this find thing, so the README might tell us. We could also poke around in the database code and probably find out. The other thing is we could probably guess that find, even if it doesn't explicitly say, we could probably guess that find is going to give us back users, and we could always console log what we get here to try and figure out what it is. So let's actually just do that. Users. So I think it's users, but I don't know for sure right now. So this code is not exactly complete, but it's far enough along that we could probably figure this out. So let's save it. And then let's make a little request. So localhost.api users. Uh-oh. Ruh-roh, my server crashed. What happened? What went wrong? What could it have been? Someone already noticed this, actually, before I even ran it. But DB is not defined, yes. So once again, because we're in node land now, we want to use require. So it's nice to kind of have some package requires at the top and then some file requires. So we required express, which is a package, but now we're going to actually require a different file. So we have data/db, and we don't need .js. We can, it's optional. So this should give us our DB, and then I've saved it back into DB. Here's a slightly trickier question. Why did the server, let me comment this out for a minute. So we got rid of that. Why hasn't my server crashed yet? Right now my server is up and running. It crashed when I made the request because it's just listening, right? So this code inside of this callback will not run until I actually make the request. So it won't crash until this code runs, and this code doesn't run until we make this request. So yeah, so let's put this back though, because we don't want our server to crash. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this again. Uh-oh, what happened here? Okay, cool. So it looks good. It looks like our users is what we think it is. It's an array of these little user objects. So that's cool. That's nice to confirm that. So what do we want to do with our users now that we know that they are what we think they are? What do we want to do with these things? Display them. Send them. So yeah, so display them. I think you guys are still thinking like front-end developers. It's true that they will display, but from our perspective as the back-end developer, we don't care. The front end can do whatever it wants with them. It can display them, it can send them to me in an email, whatever it wants. We just care about sending them. What the front end does is up to the front end. So res.send users. Is there a better method than send? Send will work, but is there a better method? JSON, yeah. We'd prefer JSON just to make sure there's no question that it's going back as JSON. So let's try it now. Awesome. Looks like it worked. We got a status 200. Sweet. So let's talk about our catch. What do we want to happen in our catch? We will, so res.status, so we will need to set our status. We still need to send something back. It's important that there's always a response. So this res.json, we still need to do this. So I'm gonna send back a little, normally you don't wanna send back the actual raw error message here. You wanna send back something Like, you know, if it were more sophisticated, we might actually check what the error was, but let's just send back a message that says failed to get users. Cool. So if something goes wrong, we'll get this message back. However, excuse me, right now it would, remember, status defaults to 200, and 200 is like a A-OK thing. So we do need to set a status. So status is a method, and we need to put our status code in here. Go ahead and do this. What status code? Any ideas what status code we might want to send back here? So 404, 404 isn't quite right because we don't know what went wrong. We need something a little more. 404 is not found. So 500 is actually a really good kind of catch-all. Once again, if we were spending more time with this, we'd probably want to break things out and send more detailed status codes and messages, but 500 is going to be our kind of go-to catch-all. Another way we can know what status code to send is the README will actually tell us. So down here, where's our gets? If there's an error, send back a 500. So now we know that's what it wants. But in the future, you're going to have to be able to come up with these codes yourselves. So there we go. We have a little catch in place here. And that's it. So we've handled, really, there's two different cases here. We make a DB call. Either we're going to find our users or we're not. In both cases, we are sending back a status and we're sending back a response. Remember, those are the two critical things you need, is to send a status and a response every time. The status here is implicit, it's a 200. The status here is explicit because it's the 500. But in both cases, we're sending back a status and a response. Why not a 404? Because something could have gone wrong. There could have been an error in the DB code. 404 implies that what you're looking for isn't there. It could be very well that the users are there. It's just that something in our database code crashed. So we wouldn't want to send back a 404 because it implies to the client that the thing they're looking for doesn't exist. But we don't know if that's really what caused the error or not. And you'll see that in a little more detail when we go into this next endpoint. So this one is good to go. Let's go ahead and write our next endpoint. So where are we going to start in this endpoint? We absolutely need DB find by ID. Oops, ID. But find by ID requires an ID. So where do we get our ID? And you guys are right that we need it and a catch here. It's the parameter. You guys remember how to get that parameter out? rec.params, awesome. So I will use this slightly fancier syntax. Equals rec.params. Cool. So just pulling a little reminder. I'm just saying, hey, find the ID on the params and create an object with it on it. So cool. So now did I ID, then presumably this is a user. We could always console log and double check that. And then I guess I don't need, those are excessive. All right. What do we want to do with our user? Excuse me. In our then, we've presumably found a user. res.json user, awesome. And what do we want to do down here in our catch? Yep, so something very similar to what we did up here. I'm even gonna copy this over. Just gonna change field to get user. Cool, so let's try it out. We see we have a user 1. Looking good, status 200, user 2. What is going to happen if I try to find user 3? We saw from our master list that there is no user 3, but what happens? Error, fail, nothing. On the surface, nothing, but we see that we got back a status 200. Huh, that's not good. So here's a question. What do we wish had happened? We want an error, we want a, so in this case, we actually don't need a status 500. In this case, we can actually guarantee that the reason that this went wrong is because that user does not exist. So this, perfect, 404. This is a case where we could use the 404 because we're confident. So how, in this little section, we know that it got to this point, right? Because we got our status 200. So how could we do a little check to see if our user is there or not? An if statement, yeah. So, and here's a more pertinent question maybe. What happens, what does it send us back if the user doesn't exist? It's not really clear. So if we request, if we put in an invalid ID into find by ID, we don't get an error, we get something else back. So let's find out what it is. Undefined. So this is a DB design choice. The designer of the DB code could have chosen to throw an error if the ID wasn't there, but instead it just sent us back undefined. But now that we know that, the fix is pretty easy. We can say if user, in other words, if user is defined, then we want to send this back. Else, we can do our error handling. So now we could do res.status. We feel pretty confident that a 404 is going to work here because we know that it sent us back undefined instead of throwing an error. And then we could send back a more specific JSON that said something like message, oops, message, user does not exist. Perfect. Yeah. So let's try it now. Cool, we got back our 404, we got back our error message. I think we've done it. So there it is. We've just created a server with 2 endpoints. One for finding a master list of users, one for finding a specific user by ID. So this is a little window into what we'll be doing. So really, this is the basis for everything we'll be doing. So we can think about how this gets more complicated. What if we were dealing with users and posts and messages and comments and friends and this and that? We could see how even this simple basic thing that we've started could start to spiral and get more complicated. Of course, it's already going to start to get more complicated on Thursday when we start to look at other requests. What about this DB file? This was provided for us. At some point in a couple weeks, we're going to have to start writing that logic ourselves and connecting to the database. And then there are things like authentication. We want to make sure that if you're requesting this information on this user that you have permission to. Maybe this user information should only be accessible if you're logged in as that user. Or maybe if you're logged in as that user, you see more than if you're not. That's authentication related stuff. So we can see that what starts out as something that's fairly basic can spiral into complexity. But luckily we have a lot of weeks to go over that and explore the different cool things we can do. And of course, there's finally testing. We want to have checks in place that make sure that this is actually sending back the right status and the right information so that if our coworkers tweak our beautiful code and break it, we instantly know So that's all the types of things we'll be exploring over this section. So let me go ahead and go over your homework really quick, and then I'll answer any last questions you have, and then you are free to work on this. So the homework Node Express Lab looks extremely similar to the stuff we did tonight. I apologize, the information on the README does not pertain to us part-timers, so not due Monday. Monday was yesterday. So this will be due by tomorrow, and then the second half of this will be due by Saturday. So the first part of this is you're really doing something very similar to what we did together tonight. You're trying to define these get endpoints. So just like we saw tonight, you're going to have to fork and clone. You're going to have to, I actually didn't fork. I cloned directly. Don't tell anyone. You're going to have to install. There's a DB file that has some hopefully familiar looking methods on it. You'll have to start your server, and you will have this schema. So now your resource, a little reminder of this word resource, is posts instead of users. But a lot of the same principles are going to be the same. And they've given you details on what the endpoints are and what the request should look like. So that is your homework. Ooh, Axios, good question. So let's talk about Axios. So Axios is one way of making requests. So Axios is like the proactive side of it. Axios is how we want to request things. You don't need Axios to build a server because you're not requesting. You're just waiting. You're handling requests. It's the other side of the coin. If your server needed to request things, let me give you an example actually of when Axios would be used on backend code. Let's say that your user was submitting information about their address. So you received an address from, this is actually very relevant to me because all the time I'm trying to fill in my data online and I'm told my address is false because it's not in the postal service, as I mentioned earlier. So what happens when I deal with that aggravating issue, and it makes me angry because I know how easy it would be to fix it on the server side, is that I make a request to say, hey, let me submit this data about myself. And then the server takes my address data and makes a different request to a postal service API. And then that comes back and says, yes, this address is real. And then if it's a well-handled website, it'll send something back to me, the user, and say, are you sure this is correct? And then I'll say yes. And if it's a poorly written site, it'll just say error, we can't, and then I pull out my hair. Anyways, so yeah, so servers definitely make requests too. The best example I can give you of when that happens is to validate. If you want to validate data using an external API, like the Postal Service API, you could do that. I used to work with medical data. So I would get data, there's something called an MPI. It's like a clinician ID number. And then I would request to an MPI server to see if it was valid or not. So you might use Axios as when you're writing code, and you could write up, if you wanted to write up an Axios request that pinged this endpoint, you could see what happens and see it in action. There's an easier way to test your code for the homework tonight is just to use the browser. And an easier way to test your code in general is to use Postman, which we'll see on Thursday. But if you wanted to, you could write up some Axios code and some front-end code and see your server in action. Can I scroll up a bit on this, or the Lambda, and the link to this repo, it's Lambda School/Node Express Lab. It is in Training Kit. You can find it in there. Scroll up to, or scroll down. Okay. Cool. I will save the code I wrote today. I will not send it to you yet because I want you guys to struggle. Ha ha ha. No, because I don't want you to just copy and paste this for the homework. And if you've been coding along and you have a copy of this, please don't just copy and paste this. Try to use it for reference. Excuse me, if you're stuck, but try to write this from scratch. You will learn it a lot better if you do it that way. Oh wait, scroll up on the GitHub link. I'm sorry. Here? Is this where? Whatever, you guys can go to the link yourselves and scroll. Sorry. All right, any other questions? Share the link. All right, fine. Where did we use rec in the first endpoint? We didn't. So you don't always need rec. It always has to be there, because if you just said res here, the first thing is rec. So even if you call it res, that's actually referring to rec. So make sure you put both in, even if you're not using rec. But rec is only needed when there's something we need from the request. And in this case, we know the URL, that's really all we need. There's no extra data. If there's a parameter or if there's a body, which we'll see on Thursday, then we definitely need to use this. But as you can see here, not every request handler actually needs to use rec. We will always use res though, because we need it to send a response. All right, other questions? Formatting, there's no style guide for the homework. I mean, I think as you guys saw, when my message was a little longer, I would put these on 2 lines, but it's also okay to put it on 1. You know, I mean, get your tabbing and white space right. I don't want to see any like nasty code, but as far as the minutia, that's up to you. I'm always a big fan of use spaces, not tabs. But yeah. And when I say use spaces, not tabs, I don't mean literally press your space bar twice. I mean, format your text editor so that when you press tab, it's technically 2 spaces. All right, anything else? All right, I see some typing. I'm getting the general impression that everyone wants to go and work on this. So let's do it. All right, thank you guys so much. It's been fun. It's the start of a journey. As always, you know, please utilize Slack, utilize your PMs, ask questions, interact with each other. You know, we're not in this alone. I will be kind of lurking around, maybe not tonight, but tomorrow, seeing where you guys are at with this. But beyond that, I will see you guys on Thursday for the second half, when we get to explore Postman and do some other types of requests. All right, good night, everyone, and good luck with the homework.